Okay, we are live now. You can start.
Perfect. Hi, everybody. Welcome to this week's Product People live stream. And today we have a very, very interesting topic that I would like to talk about and share with Colleen, actually. Please do ask a lot of questions. We have a QR code here for all of you to ask your questions. And moving into it, Colleen will talked about today how to define product metrics. This is a topic that I'm very, very interested about, actually. I would like very much to hear plenty from Colleen. And she's a product coach and advisor, former PM at Airbnb and Procter& Gamble. Um, a little bit about myself. My name is Alejandro. I am an associate product manager consultant for Product People. I have 6+ years in product management and growth topics. I've worked for B2C companies mostly. And my background is in business and data analytics. Um, what we do, and this is a little bit about Product People now, is we are interim product management and product leadership, product ops for 42 in-house employees. We do. And we also curate free events and talks for one of Europe's largest PM communities with almost 33,000 members. This is how we give back to the community. Um, for the first thing that I would like everybody in attendance to do is help us to answer this poll right here. It's basically about what is the biggest challenge you faced when defining product metrics. We have four types of answers: understanding which metrics are most relevant, aligning metrics with business goals, ensuring data accuracy and reliability, communicating metrics effectively, to stakeholders would be the last one. And while that happens, maybe we can see how the poll is going. Nice, I see that 100% is aligning metrics with business goals up until this point.
Interesting.
Yes. Um, I think we can give it a few more seconds. And while that happens, without further ado, I would love to just stop sharing my screen really quickly and give it away to Colleen.
Perfect. So we pop this up on the screen here, but I'm curious, did the poll change? Do we have a new winner, or is everybody on the aligning your metrics to your business goals still?
It's still pretty much 100% on aligning metrics with business goals.
Interesting. Well, I'm so excited to hear the questions that come up about this also. I'm imagining that will be our top topic. So I'm here, we'll go through, I have a little bit to share with you, and then we'll have a lot of time for Q&A and discussion. So this piques my interest. Very rarely do we get 100% of a poll result with just one answer. So put those questions in that Ale shared in the QR code there to start accumulating your questions. We'll definitely have a lot of time for that at the end. But thank you for the wonderful introduction, Ale. I'm Colleen. I'm here to talk to you about finding your product metrics today. And, you know, there's so much data out there. There are so many metrics to pick from. And there's also so much content out there about metrics. But we're faced with, as product managers, the choice of how do we choose what works for our product? As I was reflecting on the guiding principles that I've used throughout my career and now in my coaching in defining metrics, it made me think of the scene from Alice in Wonderland, where Alice comes to this fork in the road and is trying to decide which direction to take. And she sees our friend, the Cheshire Cat, in a tree and asks him, which road should I take? And the Cheshire Cat's response is, well, where do you want to go? And Alice's answer is, I don't know. Then the cat says, it doesn't really matter. The reason why this scene came to mind as I was thinking about what has guided me to setting metrics is how important it is to know what direction you are going in and why, which made me smile because that very much ties into your business goals and where you are going as a company, where you are going as a product. And this scene also came to mind because of our good friend, the Cheshire Cat. And this is a fun reminder. Not only did it give me my theming for today's presentation, I love the color purple, but it also is a reminder of how easy it is to get lost in riddles. If you know Alice in Wonderland, the Cheshire Cat pops on the screen and always just spins words and half disappears and comes in and out of the others and offers tons of riddles up to Alice. And, you know, this could be any different thing leading you astray or into just an abstraction where you're not really sure where you are or if you're even there. At times, the Cheshire Cat just completely disappears as well. And so when we think about Alice in Wonderland, we need that guiding direction. We need to understand where we're going and why. And that is so important when we think about metrics as well. As Ali mentioned, I'm Colleen. My current career is a product and leadership coach. What I do is I work with generally heads of product of growth and scale companies as they are working to build their teams, build their leadership skills, and build their growth strategies for their products and companies all at once, which is a very difficult role. And I'm there as a coach to help support them along the way. I worked for the last almost 20 years in product. The last 6.5 were at Airbnb. Also have worked in financial services. I've worked in physical products as well as digital, and started a business selling handmade jewelry from South America with artisans that I met while living there. It was made with seeds that were from the rainforest. And also started my career at Procter & Gamble, working in treasury systems. So I do have a bit of a finance background as well. And teach at UC Berkeley, also teach at General Assembly, and have done a lot of teaching as well as coaching in this next stage of my career. What we're going to talk about today are 3 things that I've learned about defining product metrics. So I'm going to talk a lot about my specific experience and some key moments that really helped me define how I think about metrics. And these are things that I now leverage as I'm coaching other product people and other product leaders as we're making these tough decisions around what metrics matter for their products. And after I share these 3 things, we'll open it up for some Q&A and discussion. And I'm super excited to hear the questions that you have, or also the things that you've learned, or the things that you've used as your guiding principles throughout your career, especially around metrics. Before we jump into those 3 things, I want to ground on where metrics fit into the picture. Metrics are an important tool, but they cannot stand alone. I think about product a little bit like a puzzle. We need all of these things. We need the vision, what life gets to be like for your customer when your product exists. We need the strategy, what we'll do to create that for our customer and when we'll do it, in what order. We'll need the roadmap, the plan to get there, and we need the backlog. We need the actual work to get us along that path. We need these 4 things, and we need metrics. I encourage you to think of metrics as your signposts along the way. They help you check, are you going in the right direction? Very much like the signposts we saw in that Alice in Wonderland scene. But if all you have are the signposts, we go back to that scene. We don't know where we're going. And this is where it's so important for it all to come together. And the Cheshire Cat gave us some cool colors here because it might feel like a swirling mess sometimes, but we need all 5 of these things to be there and for them all to play together. And it's grounded in this vision, in the customer, for where we are going, that direction we're heading. And those metrics, when we have that grounding, can give us good signal of whether we are going down the right path, whether we are going in the right direction. With this in mind, it very closely ties to the first thing I find to be incredibly important, which is just that, staying grounded in the vision and staying grounded in your customer. This is how you decide what metrics really matter for your product. When you go out into the industry and into the content, you hear a lot about OKRs. You probably hear a lot about North Star metrics. The very popular North Star metric that a lot of companies use, daily active users, or some type of usage metric, whether it's monthly, whatever it is. I will ask you this question. Does that metric work for every product? And the answer is no. But how do I decide what products it works for and what products it doesn't? Well, we go back to what our customer values, what our customer is trying to achieve with the product, and how we are helping them achieve that goal with our product. When you think about, for example, Duolingo, is it enough to just log into the app every day? No. The goal of using Duolingo is to learn a language. Well, we're only learning the language when we actually complete something. So one of the key metrics for Duolingo is not just logging into the app, but completing a lesson. If we look at Airbnb, is daily active user a good metric for Airbnb? How often do you plan a trip? Are you traveling every day? Probably not. You probably plan 2 to 3 big trips a year. So what metric then matters for Airbnb? Now with experiences, it was a little different, especially when you could do something local. Well, then maybe the usage was a little bit more often, but it wasn't similarly just logging into the app and looking at it. We're looking at an action being taken, booking a night, booking an experience, how often you came back to do it. And if we take it a level deeper, my favorite story that really helps me understand how important it is to stay grounded in the customer and the vision when you're thinking about your metrics comes from Airbnb experiences, where not only are we just looking at, did people book the experience or not, but we are looking at really what the base of what customers were looking for when they came to the platform was. And this turned into, and I'm sharing these articles here, this article here that our researcher, Hannah, wrote about early days Airbnb experiences called Measuring Magic. And that was something we talked about a lot, where our metric was whether or not a trip was magical. Now, I will admit, when I first joined the team, the scientist in me, or the science background and the finance background in me, was like, this feels so crazy. How are you going to measure something like magic, right? That isn't a tangible concept. But when I embraced it, it taught me a really good lesson, that it forced us to really start in the customer experience. We needed to really understand it. What made it magical? How do we define magic? How would we describe magic? What does it look like? How can I tell if something's magical or not, whether it meets that definition? What might show us that there's magic present? And now we start getting to things that we could measure. Sometimes, though, it's tempting to just start with the metrics. How do we measure whether or not people are using our product? But this lesson really stuck with me of, we need to start with a customer experience. We need to start with the vision. And we need to look for ways to signal whether or not that is happening. And by getting creative here, and with something as elusive as magic, we actually got to some very tangible metrics to be able to understand what was actually happening and whether or not the experiences that we had on the platform met the quality bar that was an important part of our vision. And we found ways to actually incorporate that into feedback and create that as a really core component of the platform. But if we didn't start with a customer, if we didn't start with this concept of measuring magic, I personally don't know if we would have gotten there. And so that reiterated to me is something that I think about a lot of, well, it felt really weird, it felt really intangible. Embracing it helped us get to a better answer. It helped us get to metrics that were very specific to our product and what we were trying to create in our vision. And that leads me to the next kind of lesson or guiding principle that I've kept, which is keeping it simple. You can have too many metrics. And one team I was part of had over 100. Imagine trying to do a weekly business review with 100 metrics. Very challenging. Preparing for that meeting alone to get all the trends and understand what's happening with every metric, that was a lot. Can you imagine the dashboard? We're starting to look like Alice in Wonderland again, when there's all these things blinking. We're in a rocket ship. We're not sure which ones to pay attention, which ones really matter. We can have too many. So part of this is really distilling down to what really matters. If we go back to the example of magic, well, we could see evidence of tons of different things maybe, but what really mattered? This also feeds into how you define your metrics. We don't want to make it too complex. And we also want to use common language, something that everyone can understand, ideally in a way that also ties it back to that vision and that customer behavior. When I'm talking about keeping metrics simple, I recently read this article from Shreyash Doshi, who is one of my favorite product thinkers out there. He has a lot of really great content around how to think as a product manager. And he wrote this one that I read a while ago, and I keep thinking of it because it just makes me laugh, and it also hit really close to home because he calls this exotic metrics, a parable for product people, about how we sometimes overcomplicate things. And we feel like our metric needs to be really well defined, that all the specifics need to be called out, that it needs to be really unique to our product. And this article, I encourage you to read it, goes through how this metric kind of balloons in complexity to the point where it's such an abstraction, it's actually really difficult to measure. And then it adds no value. And then we're back to the drawing board, but then we get tempted again because it feels too simple. But simplicity is what we're going for. And this made me think back to another example. And this was also in Airbnb experiences. We had this metric called attach rate. And that language alone, when I say it, you probably have no idea what the metric was about. Well, you're not alone, because even though I was part of the team, when I first heard it, I was like, what does that mean? How attached I am to something? I'm not quite sure. And it also got really complicated because it had 7, I'm pretty sure, if I remember correctly, 7 different definitions in terms of how you could calculate this metric. So talk about confusing. I remember more so talking about which definition we wanted to use and all these different components, which wasn't necessarily adding value. We weren't moving the metric by constantly revisiting that or having to remind people of what it was. So I've made you sit and wonder long enough. What was that metric, Colleen? Well, what it was about is how often somebody who books a home on Airbnb also books an experience. Great metric, especially when we look at multiple products and creating a magical trip. Keep it simple. Why couldn't we stop there? It very much uses common language, ties back to the customer experience, but you can see the temptation to be really specific in the definition and sometimes potentially the need, because what does it mean? How would we know? And we can go into like when it happens, does it matter when they do it? And we should ask those questions. So I'm not saying we should just take everything at face value. We should ask those questions, dig into it, but then abstract away the complexity so that when we do talk about the metric, everybody understands what it is, and it is something that is measurable and something that is going to add value in our conversations. So it's not like the Alice in Wonderland example again, where we have 6 different permutations of the metric and we're not sure which one we should be looking at the dashboard. That's not helping anybody. We might actually be better, this might sound sacrilegious, to have no metrics in that case when they're there and they're just kind of adding confusion. It's tough to say where the value is. So keeping it simple, defining your metrics in a way that's not too complex, that uses common language that everybody in the company can understand, and also being selective about your metrics. You don't want to have too many. But that leads us to the third one, which is understanding the layers. In my experience, there is never just one metric. I do like the concept of a North Star metric. To me, it always felt a little too simple. There was never one. There was never one metric that fully encapsulated the vision, in my experience. So this left me with this important point of really understanding the layers and how the metrics relate to each other. this starts to be how I think about metrics, is that you have a suite of metrics where, very similar to the suite of metrics you might use to monitor your health, right? If we only focus on one thing, we're missing the whole picture. So maybe you're monitoring your blood pressure, your cholesterol, your oxygen usage, your, I don't know what some of the words are for, like, I know the medical terminology for some of these health metrics, but you're not just monitoring one. We're not just focusing on one. And the whole picture tells us how we're doing. One specific metric might give us a slice, but it doesn't tell us the whole story. And so what I found to work really well for me in my career is using something like a metrics tree that really shows how your metrics relate to each other. Now, this can get messy. Well, this one I have on the screen looks really clean and the branches are really clear. It doesn't always look like that. And I'll give you an example. When my last role at Airbnb was working on the payments platform team, and I was working on our host payments, how our hosts received their money and understood their earnings on the platform. A big metric for us was payments on time. Now, that sounds intuitive, but it was so important for us to be able to tell that story for why this metric mattered so much and how it fit into the overall customer experience. It was really important to be able to tell the story above that metric. How did this metric relate to the quality of the experience on the platform? It was really important because if you're not getting paid, there's a breakdown of trust. So it was very important for the quality of the experience. It was very important for retention of our host community. It was very important for their satisfaction. It was very important for the quality of our product. And how that tied into some of the higher level metrics for the company was it did have impacts on the supply of our hosts on the platform. It did have impacts on the quality of the experience or the quality of the trip. We could measure that through customer support issues. We could measure that through various different ways. We could tell the impact of having a payment on time or not having a payment on time. But even within that metric itself, that metric is pretty complex. If you know anything about payments, you know payments are anything but simple. But we did distill down to a clear definition of what a payment on time meant. And that brought us down a few layers where we started thinking about, well, how will we know that a payment is made on time? How can we measure that it was made on time? And that included a mix of host behaviors, things like the host needed to add a payout method. They needed to add a way to get paid. We needed to measure system reliability. Did our transaction processing happen as it was intended to? We also needed to measure our partner reliability because we depended on a lot of partners to distribute money and funds around the world. Were our partners reliable in that last leg of the journey of the money to our hosts? And so that led to a whole nother suite of metrics that related to payments on time that had impact on the broader business. And it was so important to be able to understand those layers, because if I was presenting to a payments leader, they maybe are putting on a payments lens. But if I was presenting to a business leader why my metrics mattered, I needed to show them how it fit into their picture, how it aligned to their objectives. And I needed to understand then how this had wider impact. And so it's understanding both above and below potentially of the metric and out to the other sides. You might have noticed that I didn't just ladder up to one metric. I laddered up to quite a few. And so again, these branches and these connections might look more like a mind map. It might look less like a tree where it's really clean and confined, but it's really important to understand how they relate. And for me, I'm a visual learner. And so it's really helpful to actually map it out and say, like, here are the metrics. How do they relate to each other? And how do they relate to the customer, to our vision, so that it all kind of came together and the pieces of the puzzle came together. And that helped me pull all three of these principles together as I think about metrics, doing this mapping exercise, because it forced me to ask those questions. Are the metrics that are on my map, are they grounded in the vision and customer? Are these metrics going to tell me whether or not I'm going in the right direction? Are they the right signals that I should be paying attention to? It forced me to ask, Are they simple? Can I understand them? It's a good question to ask, because there were times when I asked that and the answer was no, if I'm being honest. And if I couldn't understand it, that was a big problem. But more importantly, could the people I'm working with understand it? People in different teams, people in different functions. Can I explain it to them? That oftentimes gave me good signal of whether or not we were being too complex. So can people understand it? But also, can we measure it easily, right? Or are we doing these like giant processes where it takes us an entire day to put together the metrics dashboard for a review? Well, then we're having some issues with actually calculating and defining the metric as well. And then the last piece is understanding those layers, how everything comes together. And I would add that where we go back to this original slide of the vision, the strategy, the roadmap, and the work, and we layer the metrics on that and see how it all fits together. And with that, when it all comes together, we have a much clearer path. And the Cheshire Cat is just a fun little buddy coming along with us for the ride, instead of being a riddler and a distraction that's maybe sending us in an unknown direction. So that ends the piece here of these three key things that I've learned when I think about reflection on my experience in product and how it impacts how I think about metrics today. I'm curious to hear more from all of you. So I'd love for you to take a moment and reflect on what was most useful for you from what I shared today and the stories I told, and the three things that I really learned and have taken with me to use as my guiding principles. And also curious to hear your questions. So we will switch over and hand this back to Ale to close us out, and also happy to keep in touch with folks. So add me on LinkedIn. If we don't get to your question today, feel free to message me. I'm happy to continue the conversation. I know 30 minutes will fly by very quickly. With that, I will stop sharing and hand back the presentation to you, Ale, to close us out.
Thank you so much, Colleen. This was amazing. And I love the fact that we can now go to some questions. You're looking at the correct screen, right? The Q&A screen.
Yes,
Yep.
that is what I am seeing.
So I invite everybody that is here with us today to please check out the Slido code 2966237, or get a hold of your phone camera and catch this QR code that is right here right now. I will give you, let's say, 5 more seconds to get into this QR code, and then I will just quickly talk you through about a few things that we do here at Product People. We have obviously use cases here at Product People on when to engage with us. 3 main ones. We do interim or fractional product management or product leadership. We cover permanent positions while you're hiring, as it often takes 3 to 9 months to hire for a role. We also do parental leave covers for 3 to 12 months, and also do important and urgent initiatives, meaning driving product discovery and or delivery, building MVPs, developing strategy and road mapping, etc. We also do product coaching or consulting. We can coach your product management team, appraise their skills and set up personal development plans, create and streamline processes and programs from 0 to 1, basically, in hypergrowth or at scale. And finally, we do product discovery. We can discover the next impactful initiative or product, and run a low or no code pilot or MVP for your organization. These are the selected B2C clients that we've been working with in the past. As you can see, it's from Zalando to Blinkist to FreeNow. And for B2B clients, it's a lot as well, from the World Health Organization to Pliant and remote as well. And some stats here that are always very interesting to mention. We've been working with 200 cross-functional teams in the past for 70 plus clients, from Series A startups to publicly listed companies. 42 product leaders and product managers are in-house and full-time to ensure quality of service for our clients and a stronger career development path for our team members. and 62% of our team are women, and 66%, sorry, are in leaderships, meaning we have a strong bias to promote from within our firm and attract more women than the tech industry average, thanks to our skills before CV's hiring process. And yes, I see now that there's plenty of questions. I will leave this Q&A slide for a bit while I go out and read one by one the questions sorted by how many likes do each question has. So, Colleen, for the first one, do you have examples on how to document this magical customer experience that you mentioned?
How to document it? For what purpose? That would be my first question. This was a really important thing to document and share. The reason why I ask for what purpose is to be clear of what the message is that we're sharing. So how we documented it, this was a lot of actual customer research. The article that I shared, and you'll see the slide deck, the picture of it is there. It was the article called Measuring Magic. And Hannah, who was our researcher, the research lead for Airbnb experiences, goes into what was done to really capture the customer experience and to really define what made something magical. And I came in at the tail end of them doing a lot of this research and saw a lot of what was already done. And some of the artifacts that were created and the things that became part of our onboarding for anyone who joined the team were, there's a video of the first experience, which Hannah mentions in the article, where it talks about a experience that was handcrafted by the Airbnb experiences team for somebody traveling in town to San Francisco. They spent, I think, with over 600 hours crafting the experience and recorded it. Part of the Airbnb team was with this person as they went through the various different things that they crafted for them. So that video is something that everyone saw. We also had a ton of customer quotes. They weren't testimonials, but it was more quotes from the research of what people said when we saw these moments of magic. It was also so important for us to use the product and to experience this ourselves. So we were highly encouraged not only to host an experience, to go on the experiences, also shadowing them in research to really distinguish for ourselves when we saw these things and when we didn't. So my reaction is, it can't just be a document that you read. It has to be something you experience. And that doesn't mean that I have to go through everything that Hannah went through, everything that the researcher went through, but I need to go through some of it. And it needs to be in a way that it's actually experiential for me as well, so that I can build that ability, and you might call it product sense. I can build that ability to distinguish for myself when it's there and when it's not, and what that means. And so, those are some of the ways I would say, like sharing out the customer research in creative ways and creating artifacts that are representative of that experience in terms of, some of it was, we all knew what our top experiences were. We knew why they were so special. We knew the story of the host. And those were things that were very actively shared as part of the team to help us all really understand. And what it boiled down to is, how did we really understand the vision? And these were all artifacts that helped us understand that as we joined the team. So hopefully that answers the questions. I don't know if there's an ability to add more or clarify in the actual Q&A tool, but feel free to add another question there if that didn't answer it completely.
Great answer. I like it a lot. And it's always interesting to try and see how do these documented experiences directly impact the lead goal of the organization, right? Like, how are you going to grab this metric and make money as well? Second question, how do you recommend to handle metric trees in an organization that serves a marketplace? I think this one is interesting. Let's say they have supply metrics, demand metrics, but also marketplace metrics. How do you make a hold of that?
Yes, that goes back to a perfect example of when the metrics trees may not be so clean. They may have multiple connection points, and that's okay. So the important part of the exercise, what is for me, when I do an exercise like that, it's so that I understand how they're related and so I can explain it. But by no means would this be an example where it's like I can just pop this up to somebody else and they can just take it and run with it, right? It's more a way for me to critically think through it and understand the impacts, and using it as my tool to think through and discern what metrics matter, how they relate, and how I'm going to explain it. Less so a metrics tree, less so as an artifact that I'm just going to share with everyone and expect them to understand. I'm trying to think, like, I actually rarely ever showed a tree like that, but it was a very important tool for how I thought about it. Generally, how I showed the metrics was through telling the story. And you heard me do that a little bit with the payments. I would have to do it a lot more in the organization, depending on who I was talking to, made me focus on different parts of the map. And a great example, I mean, when you zoom out and you look at maybe Airbnb experiences overall, there's a supply, there's a demand, and there's marketplace dynamics in terms of the interaction between the host and the guest. And yeah, there were a lot of complexities. And that is also why I'd emphasize that it's not just one metric, especially in marketplaces. You can't just have one metric because you're missing a whole bunch of the other things that are happening there. So that serves 2 points of like, yes, the trees aren't going to be super clean. And generally the tree is a way that I use to critically process and think about my metrics, less so something I use to document and show. And then the third part, reemphasizing that it's a suite of metrics that we're talking about here. In my experience, I've never seen we can only have one metric and it's just, this is what we all march towards. It's a little bit more nuanced than that. Maybe there's a keystone metric or a really important one that kind of, I think about it a little bit like a keystone species, right? If this metric is off, we know something is wrong in the environment, but we might not know exactly what it is. For those of you who don't know, a keystone species is like the crocodile in the Everglades or the otters in San Francisco, where they're like a really important creature in the ecosystem. And if their population is dwindling, it's a sign that something is going wrong. And that's kind of how I think about the North Star metric. But you don't necessarily know what's going on unless you have some other things that you can look at, where we're like, ooh, we see this happening, either good or bad, but we're not quite sure why. The suite of metrics helps you get there. So it goes back to saying that, especially in marketplaces, there's, we kind of have to look at things beyond just, one of the kind of key metrics or the core metrics at the top.
Great answer. Thank you so much. And it's always a lot about communication within other domains within the organization, I think. Next question. I think this is a fun one. What apps do you use to track metrics the most?
In my experience, there's a lot of Google Sheets. I hesitate to say that because I know there's so many metrics tracking tools out there. The reason why I say Google Sheets was there's different snapshots of the metrics that mattered. We had a lot of really great dashboards that showed metrics real time, that also showed history. We could do a lot of analysis, et cetera. But most of my role in product was synthesizing and communicating. And so it was taking out what we learned from that and communicating it. And oftentimes that meant snapshotting today against a baseline and explaining what happened, and or explaining what was on the dashboard and why, or potentially explaining what we're planning to do to move the metric and why that was so important to our strategy. So, a lot of that happened outside of the tools. However, that wouldn't have been possible if those tools weren't in place. So it still emphasizes the importance for having those tools. And Airbnb used a mix of homegrown things that were built specifically for Airbnb, and also a mix of products that are available out on the market. And most companies that I've worked with are a similar case like that, and then augment them with, especially as we're talking about them from a product perspective and where the metrics matter, in presentations, Google Slides or Google Sheets, et cetera, especially for like a weekly business review or something like that. that's generally what I've seen.
Got it. Perfect. And I think your answer is a perfect segue into the next question that I see here. How often should we look at our metrics once deploying a product that we think will directly impact them?
So my answer would be every day as a product leader. Because your metrics, again, are those signals. Again, they're not your only thing. So if we're looking at them in isolation, we go back to the 5 things that we're talking about here: the vision, the strategy, the roadmap, the backlog of work, and the metrics. We should be thinking about them all every day. Now, that doesn't mean obsessing, because yes, when we launch something, you don't want to just be like staring at your experiment results like every hour, right? Like what's happening, because that doesn't really help you. Probably just gives you anxiety. But we want to be looking at it, understanding trends, seeing what's on, like what's kind of happening, and using that as a signal, as a piece of information as we're thinking about our day to day. But it is also important to look at it over horizons, right? And that's where we often see like annual, where you do year over year comparisons, maybe you do quarter over quarter comparisons, maybe month over month, maybe week over week, kind of depending on your product and in the stage of your company, and kind of looking at the trends and things that are happening over time as well. So it's a mix of when and how to slice the metrics, but definitely be looking at them every day.
That's great. That's a great answer. And I think it touches on looking at metrics in a matter of strategic vision. But also there's questions, for example, here from YouTube that ask about how do you handle tiebreaker outcomes in A/B test, for which I guess it's a way to see metrics, but in a more tactical way, like literally on an immediate basis. Would you have an answer for that as well? How do you handle tiebreaker outcomes in A/B tests?
Yes, that's an interesting one. So my philosophy on A/B tests is that we first need a hypothesis for what we're looking for before we start the test. And that would then inform me in terms of what I would do with a tiebreaker, in terms of understanding what's actually happening and what I might need to do to learn more, or whether we're ready to just ship and move on. So that core hypothesis for what you're expecting and why you're expecting that would inform the decision. And without that information, it's hard to tell. I do see a lot of it. I see a lot of A/B tests where it's like, well, what happens if we do this? That's not a hypothesis. And if the core is we're trying to achieve a goal, and this is an example where metrics alone aren't helping us, it's like, let's try to make more people use the app. Let's try to make this happen. Let's try to get more purchases or more conversion or whatnot. We need to go back to, why do we think this will help us convert better? What are we trying to achieve with this? How will we know it's working? How will we not? And putting some thought into it before we run the experiment as well. So there's a lot to really setting up an experiment well. And then also understanding whether your results are statistically valid. There's a lot to actually really understanding A/B tests and understanding if you can actually rely on the data and rely on the results. And that's where my knowledge did not go there, but I had amazing data science partners that would work with me on that and warn me sometimes when I got too excited when I looked at the initial results of an experiment, and I'm like, yay, and they're like, hold your horses. We don't know yet. We need to do some more analysis. But it's really important to kind of dig in with that so that you're not operating with false information.
Got it. Understood. Another great answer that I think also ties very tightly into these questions that I see here also from Slido. We already talked about strategic to tactical experimentation. Now, I would like to understand from you, do you prioritize quantitative over qualitative kind of metrics?
I would say it's hard to say one's more important than the other. I would say you should have both. What I would say is that the quantitative generally tells you what's happening. Qualitative starts giving you more information as to why, what's really going on. Now, there's kind of differences between when to use the two. Quantitative can generally get you to statistical significance, where you can have confidence that this is happening with a wider population. qualitative that's more difficult to get to, but the two together, what I say is qualitative generally gives some like signal, some hunches, some suspicions, and then we might need to take that further to get it to be a little bit more quantifiable, a little bit more certain. And we have to ask that question of how far down do we need to get? Like, what does our level of confidence need to be? Can it be high level? Or do we need to have this be a scientific measurement? And that a little bit depends on the context.
Great. It's so nice to see the diversity of questions that we're getting here. And
yeah, great questions. Keep them coming.
It's very nice. We even have one from a product designer, actually. And this person is curious about the role of PMs and the relationship they have with the product designers. And this person is asking, how can I contribute to creating metrics as a designer? Yeah, I think it's a great question. It's super open. It's so nice.
I love that question. So whomever that product designer is that asked that, my best work happens when my whole team worked to set the metrics, where my designer was working with me, my data scientist was working with me, and my engineers were working with me, and research. And at times we had the luxury of also having a content person, because there's different perspectives there. And you heard me talk about the importance of staying grounded in your customer and vision. Designers out there, you're the ones who know that the best, right? Yes, we also know it from a product perspective, but that's where the magic happened at Airbnb. It's such a design-focused company. And when you see the person who wrote that article about measuring magic was the head of research, how important that function was, and how, quite frankly, we couldn't have done our jobs as product managers without that information, without that insight into what really made the difference. And so it highlights the importance of doing that collaboratively and bringing those things into it, because this is how you bring the customer and the vision into the conversation. And why I cheered so much is because I love when that design wants to be a partner in doing that, because I think it makes for such better products and such better metrics, quite frankly.
Yes, I so agree with you. It's so nice to have both the question and the answer perfectly answered right there. One other one that I see that is very interesting. Can you please give an example on how to assess whether a metric is really helping, and how do you know when to either change it or discard this metric?
Yeah, change or discard. So that's a great question. But I realized I never answered the designer's question of how do you get involved? And my answer to that would be just ask, because my guess is that people want you to be involved. So going back to that one, I would say just ask and think about where you can add the most value. And hint, it might be from that customer perspective, the vision, how we can really sharpen our metrics, how we can get to a metric that really balances our business goals with our customer values, and how we really get those metrics that are really specific to our product. Designer can really help with that, and can also really help with the communication of how we tell the story around the metric. That's where my design partners have been the best, closest partner for me in that. So just ask and think about those areas where you might be able to add value. Then we'll shift to this, it was whether to discard or keep the metric. So I kind of have two thoughts around this. The first is that picking metrics is not a scientific exercise either, just like picking your product strategy, just like picking anything else. It's a hypothesis, it's a guess. So we have to ask ourselves the question, if our metrics aren't moving in the direction that we want them to, we need to ask the question, are they the right metrics? And we should ask that. If we're asking that all the time, though, there's probably a symptom of something else going on. But we should ask and rationalize our metrics, and do that often, because things might also change. Just because the metric is a good metric right now, that might change with the evolution of your product, the evolution of your industry, et cetera. So we should constantly scrutinize our metrics and ask, are they the right ones? That being said, I also am hesitant to throw a hypothesis out the window too soon. I'll give an example of this. When Airbnb launched experiences, you have to think Airbnb had built this brand for 10 plus years, I think, at that point, of places to stay. You're going to rent an Airbnb, et cetera. So everybody associated Airbnb with homes. And we had some initial research that showed that even though people saw experiences, they thought they were like host guidebooks. They thought they were just suggestions of things to do in the city. They didn't realize they could actually book them. And this is an aha moment. I mean, we kind of knew this already, is that we need to re-educate people on the Airbnb brand. It's not just about a home and a place to stay. It's about activities and things to do. And at that point, Airbnb was also going into other areas of the trip. We had, some of the stuff with Resi and restaurant reservations. There was a lot of things with host guidebooks and like things going on where it was like other parts of the trip as well. So we had this hypothesis that education was important, and that became a key part of our strategy. So yes, some of our early experiments and some of our early things around increasing awareness and education about what Airbnb experiences were, which was a lot about merchandising. So when we think about tactically what that was, it was how we merchandised this product and the activities and things to do and how it showed up in the platform. There were some things that moved metrics in not the right way. Now, did that mean our metrics were wrong? No. Did that mean our strategy was wrong? No. It just meant that our tactics were wrong. And if we had thrown either of those other two out of the window, we probably would have missed some stuff, right? And gone in the Alice in Wonderland direction, right? Where if we think everything is moving all the time and we don't really have any grounding. And so, yes, we could ask ourselves again, do we still believe, based on everything that we've learned, that this is an important strategy, that this is the right direction? Do we still believe, based on everything that we've learned, that these are the best guideposts to measure whether we're going on in the right direction? If the answer is yes and yes, will we keep going and adjust our tactics based on what we're learning? But we might say, you know what, there's something that we learned here that is going to cause us to shift one of these a little bit. Maybe we shift our metrics a little bit. Maybe we shift our strategy a little bit. Now let's go see what happens. But the key part is to remember what you're changing, right? As we're turning these dials, remember what we're changing so that we're not just coming back and being like, we don't know what happened. If things are constantly changing, we don't have that history and that decision logic for why we did it, then we're kind of lost. And so there's that bit there of really understanding what we changed, why we changed it, what we expect to happen. And this goes back to the importance of that scientific rigor of, my two favorite analogies for product are being a detective or being a scientist. And both of those roles keep track of their clues. They keep track of their leads. They keep track of their findings, and they use it to adjust their current thinking. And they use it to explain how they got to their current thinking so that other people can understand. And that's so important to not only be able to have that critical thinking ability, but to be able to explain that decision-making logic that you used. And so that's where, if you do change some of these or find you want to discard something, you need to be able to explain why and have that be grounded in clear logic with clear evidence to support it. It can't just be, it wasn't moving, we wanted to use something else, right? Not saying that we're going to say that, but we need to have some really clear reasons why we think it's not working and what we want to change.
Great answer. Thank you so much. I think it's you're preaching to the choir here. I love it because your answer also states that we should always be very close to the customer experience, right? And we should always be tracking our steps into what did we do, did that work, and be very mindful of choosing to pivot maybe tactics, but not necessarily the whole big picture, the whole strategy towards how do we move towards it. Wow, these 30 minutes are going pretty fast in terms of Q&A. We have one last question, and I'm going to leave it really easy for you. Can you give an example for a metric map, something that comes up to mind to refresh our memories into how should we envision a metric map?
Yeah. So the metric map that when I was showing it on the screen that I was talking through was thinking about the metrics that I used when I was working on the host payment experience at Airbnb. So that was how hosts received their money and understood their earnings on the platform. And, this was a little bit of a mind map, and like our core metric for our team was about payments on time. And that part of that metric map was understanding, well, how did that fit into the business? And that's where I was explaining that it did tie into our supply. Did our hosts stay on the platform? Were they retained? Were they happy on the platform? Were they satisfied on the platform? Did we give them all the things that they needed? Or were they having to contact customer support? Or were they having problems? Were they, giving us feedback on things that weren't working? So we were able to kind of measure why that mattered at the bigger picture in terms of thinking about some of the supply metrics. We also could think about, what if we were to even take that further, I could also explain how it related to the guest. Because do you think a host who feels like they're not getting paid is going to have a great guest experience? Put yourselves in that host's shoes, right? And so there was a lot that we could do to also think about how to, and payments was actually one of the 4 key features that Airbnb started with, because that transaction of money between the guest and host without something happening on the platform is really awkward because you have to show up with cash and pay your host, right? And Brian tells the story about early days Airbnb where he stayed with a host and he kept forgetting to get cash to pay the host and how awkward it was and how that led for them to build payments as a feature. So there's a lot that we can do to actually enhance the overall experience of the host and guest as we think about making this money movement seamless and also fair, especially in terms of a mediation between a host and a guest. And then we also needed to look at, okay, those started expanding even beyond payments on time, right? So then we can also think about not just did the host get paid on time, but what are some of the different intricacies between how money shows up on the platform in this relationship between the guest and the host, and how also money shows up for the host beyond just getting their payment in terms of how they understand how much they've earned, how they file their taxes and do all the things that they needed to do as income earners on the platform, right? So now we start ballooning even more up there. And then also we can take it a level lower where we ask ourselves, well, how do we know that payments go out on time? Or in the example of hosts getting the information that they need to run their business, how do we know that they got everything they needed to file their taxes, et cetera? And so you can see, this is where it starts to get more complex and maybe not be as simple as a tree that I just put on there. But, as I'm talking this out, I'm picturing it in my head. But like I said, I never actually had an artifact. It kind of was how I was thinking about things. And now as I'm talking about it, I kind of wish I'd written it down, because what I've learned in my career is also that forcing you to put it on pen and paper really forces you to think about it a lot more critically. So even as I'm talking about it, my answer could be a lot sharper if I'd actually written it down. Because I'd be like, yeah, I know exactly all these things, how they tie together and whatnot. And it would have taken me less time to recall it as well. So 2 lessons there. Yes, they are complex. Hopefully that example gave more clarity. Also message me. I'm happy to dive into it further with anyone. So add me on LinkedIn, message me. So I know we're about to wrap up. And then second, write things down. It forces you to really sharpen your thinking. And that is a lesson that I take with me way outside of metrics, but it could have applied here of actually doing the exercise myself.
That's a great answer. Thank you so much for all of your answers. And thank you so much for the very interesting topic. I had so much fun today,
Likewise.
Colleen. And on that note, I will just again say a million thank yous to Colleen and start the outro right now. Please, if you can, and if you would like to, next week we have legal design, making legal user friendly with Isabella Godoy. She's the head of communications at Vita. And that would be basically it for us right now. Again, Colleen, thank you so much for your presence today. Your topic was amazing. I'm very interested, and I will for sure take my computer and connect with you on LinkedIn right away, so I can keep geeking out on this topic maybe. Thank you, everybody. Have a nice one, and see you next time.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. Great questions. And thank you, Ale, for being an awesome host and